It seems like every time, I talk to other white folks in particular about issues of white privilege, all of a sudden, like every white person is from Appalachia. All of a sudden, they're all from the hollers of Kentucky. And their parents were hardworking miners in West Virginia, right? Doesn't matter. You might not have even ever been east of the Mississippi River, but by God, you're from Appalachia when the conversation is about.
The system in America has been historically designed to work against black people due to a combination of deeply entrenched racism and deliberate policy decisions that have perpetuated inequalities over centuries.
So when we see a word like racism, we are talking about attitudes, yes. We are talking about ideology, interpersonal stuff, but we are by definition also talking about systems. And it's really in the systemic way that I want us to talk about the issue for two reasons. Number one, it's the way that we usually ignore it in the society. So we focus a lot on building tolerance and building understanding, and we should do more of that. There's nothing wrong with that. I think tolerance is sort of a weak word, but I guess it beats the alternative, right? But the other reason I want us to focus on systems is because, as I'll show you in a second, the systems actually feed the attitudes. Right? It isn't just that bad attitudes and quote unquote bad people, and I'm putting that in quotes because I don't think there are such things as good people and bad people. A lot of good people do bad things, and a lot of folks that we think are bad manage to do really good things. But bad systems, right, generate bad actions, bad attitudes, bad thinking. So I want us to focus on the system both because we tend to underestimate its importance, but also because I think sometimes it's the precursor to the bad attitudes that we want to also address. Now, when I talk about racism being a system, I want you to think about this for a second. Sometimes I do this in smaller workshops. I'll ask people gathered at, circular tables, take 10, 15 minutes, and I want you to sit and brainstorm with your table mates the following. If I were to ask you to come up with some policies, some practices, and some procedures, maybe in schools, maybe in the job market, maybe in law enforcement, maybe in the tax code, just any type of institutional setting. If I were to say your job is to come up with some policies, practices, and procedures that would have the effect of either creating or perpetuating racial inequality. But the trick is you've got to be real slick about it. You've got to be real subtle. It can't be obvious because, it's against the law to discriminate, right? And of course, we know that when things are against the law, they never happen, right? So your job is to craft policies that will create racial inequity, but in a way that's so subtle that you can't get in legal trouble. What might you do? And then when the people at the table do this exercise, we report back. And usually what they'll say is, well, in schools, for instance, I might decide that what we should do is we should fund schools mostly with property taxes, because I know that the effect of that will be that schools that are in poorer areas that are disproportionately of color will have less money. But since I didn't do it on purpose or obviously for that reason, I can get away with it. And then they'll say, well, I would have a regime of standardized testing whereby the only way you got into college, particularly this kind of college, was to have this kind of test score. And because of inequalities in K-12, I know going in that doing that will produce inequality. Or I might, in the job market, if I'm an employer wanting to craft discrimination and I can't do it blatantly, I might decide, hey, I'm going to hire based on networks and letters of recommendation written by existing employees on behalf of new applicants for jobs, right? So we come up with all these ideas, and then I ask the people, well, how different are those ideas from the things we actually do? Right? In other words, every one of the things that they mention are things we actually do in this country. The focus on standardized testing, even though we know what the outcomes of that will be. The property tax funding as the principal mechanism for K-12 schools, even though we know what the outcome will be. According to a New York Times report 2 years ago, half the jobs in the new economy are filled through letters of recommendation written by existing employees on behalf of people who want to get jobs. Now, in theory, that's race neutral. Right? And in theory, it's sex and gender neutral, and in theory, it's class neutral. But let's be honest about the effect of that. Who are the folks most likely to know Jim over in the accounting department? Who are the people most likely to know Mary over in HR? Well, beyond speculation, the study that this article was referencing found that overwhelmingly the folks who benefit from that old boys network kind of arrangement, right, are white, and they're male, and they're affluent, and they went to the quote unquote right colleges, whatever that means. So what this means is that if you're a person of color, or a woman of any color, or a working class white guy, for that matter. You might be the most qualified person for that next job, but if Jim doesn't know you exist, half the jobs are off limits to you. And here's the sick part. You can't sue the company when they don't hire you because they didn't discriminate against you in an illegal way. You were just scratched from the start. So it's not just that you went into the race with a disadvantage. You didn't know there was a track, right, that you were even supposed to show up to, and they didn't know to invite you. And here's the real bad thing. Jim might not be a racist in the traditional sense, or he might not be a sexist. He might be a great guy. He might have black friends. He might have dated an Asian woman once. He might have a dream catcher in his rearview mirror. He might have gone in search of a sweat lodge. He might have done all kinds of things that mark him as something other than a bigot, and yet the reality is, even with the best of intentions, he is operating a procedure, networking, letters of recommendation, right, that has an effect that is no different than if he hung out a sign that said, no black folks need apply, at least for these half the jobs, no Latinos need apply, at least for these half, no women of any color for these half. So all of a sudden, you see, this is the kind of stuff that we actually do, and if we were trying to create inequality, it's what we would do. That doesn't mean that it was done deliberately, but it means the consequences are no different than if it were. That's what we mean by systemic or institutional racism. It's what Eduardo Bonilla Silva calls racism without racist, or colorblind racism, right? This idea that you can get systemic inequality even if there's no bigot in the room. Now, I'm not naive enough to tell you there are no bigots in the rooms. But what I'm suggesting to you is if all we're focused on are the bigots in the rooms, we miss that an awful lot of inequality is perpetuated without any such persons around, or at least without the ability to prove that that is who we have around. So that's what I want us to think about. We also have to understand the way that racism is really it is a process of inertia, right? So when we are in, grade school, maybe middle school, we learn about inertia as a physical scientific property, right? A body in motion will remain in motion essentially until it is stopped by some force that is of equal or greater weight and pressure and strength. Well, that's not just a physical universe property. That's not just something that happens when you roll a rock or roll a ball down a hill or whatever, right? It's also a socioeconomic property, a political property, a cultural property. That which happens in one generation affects the next generation and the next and the next. And what's interesting is we know this on a personal level, don't we? We know that we inherit the legacy of all the messed upness of our families, right? We all come from dysfunction, some worse than others. Some of that dysfunction we talk about, some of it we take to our graves. But we all know that we inherit it, and we also know that the only way we ever work through it and come out on the other end healthier as individuals is if we confront it. We do the exact opposite as a culture when it comes to issues like the legacy and the history of racism, the legacy and the history of economic inequality, the legacy and the history of patriarchy, and all the other systems of oppression. So we act like inertia isn't real. We do this every time we talk about race. Someone will say, well, why can't we leave that in the past? Right? That was then and this is now, because everything's linear, you know? And so it's like all of a sudden, it's like we think history is like a golf cart. Right? Where, you know, on a golf cart, you take your foot off the accelerator and you just sort of stop, right? You're just done. And you're like, oh, I got to hit the accelerator again. History is not like that, right? The golf cart keeps rolling, in effect, in history. Inertia is a socioeconomic property. And it's also funny, right, when we say things like, why can't people get over the past? Because, am I wrong? I think as a country, we sort of love the past, right? I mean, that's sort of what July 4th is about. Like, we didn't break away from the British last Tuesday. That was a really long time ago, but we keep bringing it up every year, setting off fireworks, eating hot dogs and apple pie, wearing red, white, and blue, waving flags. I mean, I dare you to go up to the most patriotic guy at the Independence Day parade next year, tap him on the shoulder and say, yeah, this is nice, but when are you going to get over it? And see how that works for you. I don't think that's going to work. I think you're going to be running for your life. Probably pull a gun on you, right? Right? So we love the past when it makes us feel good. We just don't like it when it brings us up a little short. And that's true sometimes as individuals and our families. We love to talk about the great things in our family. We don't like to talk about some of that messed upness, as I said. So it's not surprising that we do it, but it's something we have to think about, because if I tell you, and I will, that right now, the average net worth, median, so midpoint net worth for white households in this country is about 15 times that of the median for black households, about 11 times that of the median Latino household, about 60% higher than the median Asian Pacific American or Pacific Islander household, about probably somewhere in the neighborhood of 7 or 8 times that of the typical indigenous native North American household. We can only interpret that a couple of ways. We can either interpret that by saying, well, white people must just invest their dollars better. They must have some secret, which Wall Street has proven is not true, right? I mean, there's a lot of white guys with MBAs and high degrees and good SAT scores that took $12.5 trillion out of the economy in the course of about 18 months. Like, there were no black folks doing that. There were no Latinos, be they documented or not, that wrecked Wall Street. There were no indigenous brothers and sisters. There was just a bunch of the smartest, highest test score having white guys wreck. And I know people get uptight when I say this, and they, like, how do you have to say they were white? That's sort of racist. No, see, that's not the definition of racism. It's not racist to point out that they were white. It's descriptive. I'm just being descriptive. And if they'd all been black, somebody would have noticed and they would have mentioned it, right? If they were Latino, somebody would have pointed it out. It would have been mentioned, and then somebody would have said, how'd they get these jobs? Oh, I know. They got them through affirmative action. They got some preferential, and then they'd be saying no more black and brown folks in banking. We still haven't said that to white guys. We still have, Jamie Dimon just got a huge bonus, right? They get their bonuses on Wall Street when they take your money. So in any event, that totally is not even in the outline. I just felt like saying it. So we can either say these people are that much smarter, or we can look at the inertia of history, right? Which is that some folks have had the capacity to accumulate stuff that adds to your net worth and your stash of wealth, and when other people could not. And wealth, unlike pure income, accumulates in a much different way. It's not just in a linear fashion, it's exponential because of things like interest. So if I'm able to accumulate stuff in one generation and hand that down, then you're able to turn around and hand that down again. Eventually, the gaps actually get bigger. Some gaps have shrunk, not nearly fast enough in the last 30 and 40 years, but there's been a slight narrowing of things like the income gap between whites and folks of color, a narrowing of the graduation rate gap between whites and folks of color. So things like that. But the wealth gap has actually grown in part because some people have had the capacity to accumulate when others did not. And much of that accumulation, of course, was financed by government intervention. The Homestead Act, FHA loans, VA loans, the GI Bill, things that either were explicitly only for white folks or were technically open to all, but in practice were not. The GI Bill technically was open to anyone who was a returning veteran, but the way that the program really operated, right, was to say that, well, if you're a black or brown vet, you've got the right to these benefits, but the college you want to go to can still keep you out if they don't want black folks and if they don't want brown folks, or the employer can still keep you out if they don't want to hire you and train you. So the right to discriminate still trumped the right of people of color to use their so-called benefits. Right now, as a result of all this inertia, the 400 wealthiest white people in this country have the same cumulative amount of wealth as all 41 million black people in this country combined. Let me restate, so you know that I did not misstate. 400 people, the same cumulative amount of wealth as all 41 million black folks combined, right? And the wealthiest 1,000 people, the same amount, well, 1,000 white people, the same amount of cumulative wealth as all black and Latino folks in this country combined. Now, no one in their right mind is going to suggest that there are 400 white people that have worked that much harder than all black Americans and 1,000 that have worked that much harder than all black and Latino folks. And yet, if that's not the explanation, what is? Well, this inertia, this ability to rack up advantages. It's like an 8-lap race. I've got a 5-lap head start. Here's the deal. I'm supposed to cross the finish line first. That's how that happens, right? And in fact, if I start out with a 5-lap head start and at the end of the race, I'm only up by 4, I'm not the faster runner, right? So in fact, if any of those gaps shrink at all, it ought to tell you something. That is that some folks are actually working harder, running faster, metaphorically speaking, and still, because of inertia, lag behind. So we have to think of racism that way. And then we have to understand that the systemic inequalities that I just described, and we could talk about many others, income disparities, educational disparities, the wealth disparities are obvious, right? But here's the thing. The outcome of all those inequities actually feeds the attitudinal biases. So it becomes a cycle, right? Because here's the thing. What's the one thing that everyone in this room at some point was taught, whether you were born and reared in this society or whether you have only, lived in this country for more than a minute, right? Doesn't matter whether you're a person of color or white, doesn't matter whether you were born rich, middle class, working class, or poor, doesn't matter whether you're born in California or born in Tennessee as I was, or born in Maine. Everyone in this country, to one extent or another, has been taught one thing in common by our teachers, maybe by parents, maybe by preachers, not in this church, but in other churches, right?
Right.
They've been taught the one thing, it's like our secular gospel. It's our creation myth as a country. And what is it? It's the idea, by God, if you work hard, you can make it, right? Anybody can make it if they just work hard. And if you didn't make it, guess whose fault that is? And if you did, you're a genius, right? Now, at some level, that notion of meritocracy has been the secular gospel, the creation myth. And I understand why we say it. I'm not saying that I don't get it. I have two daughters, 14 and 12. Don't think for 1 minute that I don't tell them that too. But here's the difference. I insist on putting the asterisk at the end of the statement. And it's an asterisk that the culture never wants to put at the end of the statement. The asterisk is the part that says, after the sentence, hey, you can be anything you want if you're willing to work hard for it. Asterisk, bring you down to the bottom of the page. Hey, Ashton and Rachel, that's my daughter's names. Just so you know, if that's really going to be true, what Daddy just told you, what you need to understand is it's not going to be enough to work hard as the individuals that you are. You're also going to have to recognize that because you are women, there will be boys, men, and sadly, even some women who will view you as lesser because of that and treat you as such. Therefore, for what I told you to be true, you're going to have to work hard, not just as individuals, but with others collectively to deal with issues of sexism. Right? But we as a culture don't like to put the asterisk at the end because sometimes I tell people that and they say, well, that's bad, Tim. You're setting them up for failure and a victim mentality. No, I'm preparing them for the real world. Not the world that I want to exist, but the world that does exist so we can create the one that we want to exist. If I don't put the asterisk at the end, it's like sending our girls down a dark alley where there's an electric fence at the end, but I don't want to tell them about the electric fence because I might make them neurotic, right? So it's like, oh, just run. No, really, it's fine. I know it's dark, scary, right? Yeah. I hear there's a fence. I don't know if it's electrified. Why don't we find out? What kind of father would I be if I did that, right? At some level, I have to tell them about the fence so we can figure out how to go under, how to go over it, how to blow it up, whatever. I blow it up metaphorically. I'm nonviolent. I'm just saying, right? We have to figure these things out, and the same is true, but as a culture, we don't put the asterisk. We just say, you can be anything. Now, what's the problem? What's the downside of that? Well, the downside of that is if you see all this inequality that I just described, and you see 400 folks with the same cumulative stuff as 41 million, and 1,000 folks with the same cumulative stuff as, probably 90 million people, Black and Latino combined, roughly, right? Or when you see, black folks with college degrees twice as likely as whites with degrees to be unemployed, even when they have the same education. Latinos with degrees, 50% more likely than whites with degrees to be unemployed. Asian Americans with degrees, 25% more likely than whites with degrees to be unemployed. If I see all that inequality and then I put it together with the propaganda that I was taught, which says wherever I end up is all about me, then it becomes almost rational, does it not? For me to then say, wow, I guess these people must really want it more. They must just work harder. These people down here, they don't work as hard. So even if I'm not a bigot, even if I was never technically taught to hate, remember that old commercial and the old slogan of the National Conference of Christians and Jews, which later became the National Council for Community Justice, or whatever they changed the name to back in the 90s, right? The NCCJ's slogan used to be, and it was sort of a riff on a line from South Pacific, right? But it was this idea you have to be taught how to hate. The thing I always didn't like about that phrase was that it was almost too simplistic, because it suggested that for you to have racism as a personal problem, you'd actually have to have a parent or a peer or somebody almost sit you down on their knee and tell you to hate this group and hate. What I'm telling you is the operative workings of the culture we share. The combination of objective stratification or inequality on the one hand and the core belief of this country on the other produces outcomes in terms of our attitudes that are almost default positions of racism, sexism, classism, right? Anyone who's on the bottom of the structure can be blamed for their presence there, and anyone who's on the top can be credited for their presence there. And so we are really going to have a conversation about how we interrogate that notion of meritocracy, because as long as that is the guiding principle, we are going to have a very hard time sort of piercing the veil. I mean, I tell this story a lot lately, and I think it's an important one. A couple years ago, I'm driving with our daughters to dance. They're both dancers, and we had just left school. And to get them down to their studio, which was downtown, we needed to go through, went down a street from the school, went right through the middle of a public housing community, right? And we've been making this ride probably for a year at this point. And here we are driving to the studio. We're driving through public housing. We get up to a stoplight in this particular public housing development, like many in Nashville, like many around the country, overwhelmingly of color, by definition, poor and low income, right? And so we get to the stoplight and we're sitting there, and my 10-and-a-half-year-old daughter at that time looks up and says, "Daddy, why is it that pretty much everyone in this neighborhood is black?" It's a great sociological inquiry. It's an anthropological inquiry. And what it realized in that moment, what I realized was this probably wasn't the first time she'd noticed that. It's not like she just noticed the demographic mix of the neighborhood, but that day was the day she wanted to ask about it. She'd been noticing it. Now, the 12-and-a-half-year-old showing off for her father wanted to, of course, jump in and provide the answer to her sister, so she immediately, before I could say anything, jumped in and said, "Redlining," and that was true. She does live in my home, and the 10-and-a-half-year-old said, "Yeah, I don't know what that means." And I said, "Yeah, don't worry, neither does your sister." It's just a word she heard. And it's true, right? The process whereby banks literally would draw red lines around neighborhoods and nobody in that neighborhood would get a loan. It didn't matter what their personal credit worthiness was, what their personal income or occupational status. It was just that they lived in a particular area. And so that, among other forms of housing discrimination, indeed was the reason why certain neighborhoods look like this and other neighborhoods look like that. So I answered the question, took about 2.5 minutes. It wasn't a long discourse, but it was enough to provide her with what? An explanation other than the default. Now, what happens if she never asks me that question? Or what happens if a child asks their parent that question and that parent either doesn't know the answer, doesn't know how to answer, is too concerned about, oh, how much do I tell my 10-year-old about oppression, right? See, I don't sweat that because they're in my house, they hear about that all the time and we just work through it. But how many parents really know the answer to that? And how many kids wouldn't even think to ask? And if they don't ask, the default position of my child is going to be what? Well, these people are here in a neighborhood where the infrastructure is clearly not as well apportioned as this other neighborhood because there's something wrong with them. That's why they live in that neighborhood and not that neighborhood. So we have to understand that sometimes our attitudinal biases come not just because somebody taught us to have those biases, but because just the normal workings of the system do it. Now, having said that, there's a lot of other things that do it too, right? Marketing works, right? Marketing works whether you're trying to sell tennis shoes or whether you're trying to sell fast food products or whether you're selling racial stereotypes. There's this thing in marketing called the rule of 11 or the rule of 12. I always get it confused. But the idea is after 11 or 12 ads for a commercial product or for a consumer product, it's about the time that you're exponentially more likely to buy it, right? So the first 5 or 6 times you're like, what? You know, by the time you get to like the 10th or 11th time, you're going, wait a minute, this is interesting. By the 12th time, you're running down to Taco Bell to get a Crunch Wrap at 6 in the morning. Something for which there was no lobby 5 years ago. Nobody ever wrote to the head of Taco Bell and was like, you know what we need? We need a taco wrapped up like a burrito, put an egg and some sausage in there and serve that to me at 6:30 in the morning. Nobody wanted that. But somebody said, watch this. I'm going to create the Crunch Wrap at 6 o'clock in the morning, breakfast style Taco Bell. We're going to run ads and pretty soon folks are going to be lined up around the block. I don't eat biscuits anymore. I eat Crunch Wraps now. And that's what they're doing because you saw the ad 12 times, 15 times, 20 times. Eventually you got, you know, sort of interested in it. Well, let me tell you, we've seen the ads for racial stereotypes more than 12 times. We've seen the ads for sex and gender stereotypes more than 12 times. We've seen the ads for class and religious stereotypes with regard to our Muslim brothers and sisters more than 12 times, you see. So if marketing works, that's why they put the chocolate at the checkout aisle, right? At the grocery. That's not just because they had some extra chocolate, right? It's not like they were just like, damn, I over-ordered the chocolate again. Where are we going to put the extra chocolate? I don't know, we could put it on the candy aisle. No, that'll never do. Let's put it up front where they pay, right? It's called impulse buying, that's why they put it there. And if that works for shoes and toilet paper and soap and toothpaste, trust me, it'll work for other things. So A, it's the working of the society making us default to those conclusions. And B, it is the fact that there are all these things that we're taught in a million different ways since we're very small children. I do workshops where I ask people, take out a piece of paper, write down all the stereotypes you know about this group or that group or this group or that group. Never once Have I had anyone in the workshop raise their hand and go, I'm sort of drawing blanks here. Can't think of any. Can I Google it? Like, can I use my phone? Can I look them up? Because I'm lost. Nobody has a problem. Now, they're all writing them down and then very quickly insisting, now, I don't believe any of these. These are not things I believe, but my Uncle Jim is all over this list. My Uncle Jim is a racist, but now not me. But the fact that you even know them, according to the research from the field of social psychology, right? Brain science research says that just knowing about the stereotypes means it is highly likely that you can have them triggered in certain moments. So we have to own that. We have to be honest about that. One more thing before I end this little setup section is how we understand privilege. Very important, right? We'll talk more about it as we go through the day. The problem, I think, we talk about privilege, people get tripped up on this because most of us didn't grow up wealthy. And we've been led to believe that privilege is just about money. Right? So I was joking the other day with some folks, and it seems like every time, I talk to other white folks in particular about issues of white privilege, all of a sudden, like every white person is from Appalachia. All of a sudden, they're all from the hollers of Kentucky, and their parents were hardworking miners in West Virginia, right? Doesn't matter. You might not have even ever been east of the Mississippi River, but by God, you're from Appalachia when the conversation is about white privilege. Now, I got folks from Appalachia, so you don't get to claim that unless you get to claim that. That to me, we take that very seriously in my part of the country. But here's the thing. I know that most white folks didn't grow up with money. I didn't. I grew up in a 850 square foot apartment from the day I was 3 days old to the day I walked out the door to go to college, right? We ran cars into the ground, only had one at a time, never took vacations. I don't think my parents ever made more than $20,000 in a year, probably more like 15 or 16. So I didn't grow up with class privilege, but privilege is not just about economic status and material. I want us to conceptualize privilege, just like I want us to conceptualize racism as a system that oftentimes isn't intentional. I want us to understand privilege as something more than material. Specifically, I want us to think of it as a psychological edge that you gain when you have the luxury of being oblivious to other people's reality. I want us to think about it as a psychological state of innocence, and by that I don't mean innocence as the opposite of guilty. I mean innocent in the sense of naive, right? That is to say that we have the luxury of not thinking about some stuff as we go through our day. And it's no different than those of us who are able-bodied, right? Having the privilege, the luxury of not thinking about ableism and the way that our disabled brothers and sisters, whether visible or invisible disabilities, have to navigate the workspace or their place of worship or their school or their neighborhood or whatever it is, because they have obstacles and barriers and things they have to think about as they plan their day that the able-bodied don't. And guess what? That doesn't make us bad people for not thinking about it. Right? It doesn't mean that I'm intentionally oppressive to the disabled because I don't think about what they have to think about, but it means I have the luxury of being stone cold ignorant to other people's truth and suffering no immediate consequence for it, because my knowledge of their truth will not be on the test. And by that, I mean whatever the test is that you have to take to prove that you're competent to do something. So I want us to think about privilege as the stuff we never have to consider. And I'll end with a story that I think makes the point. I went to college at Tulane in New Orleans, and I wasn't a very good student. I wasn't bad, but I sort of just coasted by and sort of pulled it out at the last minute kind of student. And so when I got to college, I already knew what I was interested in and what I wasn't. And I didn't pay a lot of attention to things like the syllabus and when is the exam being held. Little things like that. Like I just figured I'll find the room, I had 3.5 months to figure this out. Right, so there's a final exam, and it was in my major, actually. It was in an international relations poli-sci class. And I thought that the test was going to be at 1 in the afternoon. I'm sorry, at 1 in the afternoon. But actually, it was at 10 in the morning. So I show up at 1 in the afternoon. I sit down at my desk, and I'm looking around, and I'm thinking, I don't know who these other suckers are, but they weren't in class all year. I'm going to ace this. They're all going to fail. Meanwhile, they're all looking at me like, who is this dude? He hasn't been in this calculus class all year long. He's probably not going to do very well. So all of a sudden, I realize my error when the professor comes in and is not the one I've been sitting with for the last 3.5 months. I look at the syllabus finally, and I realize my error, and I realize something even more frightening, which is, man, if I don't get a makeup, if I don't get a mulligan on this test, I'm going to lose my scholarship. We didn't have enough money for me to stay there without it. So this was a do or die kind of thing. And I'm going to have to explain to my parents why I failed out. I'm going to have to start over. I may have to withdraw from this school and go somewhere else. So I run to his office, and now I'm hyperventilating. I mean, I am emotional, I'm crying, I'm a mess, right? I get up to his office, I'm like, oh my God, Professor Davidson, I'm so sorry. And he could tell that this was not an act. Like, this was not just so I could get in 3 more hours of studying. He could tell that it was genuine. And he said, listen, tell you what, get yourself together, get some water, go over there in my office. You can sit down at that table. You can take the test. And so he's a nice guy, and he did the right thing, even though I didn't deserve the mulligan necessarily, right? And so I go and I sit down, I take the test. I ended up doing well, and all was fine. I was telling some friends of mine this, and these friends happened to be African-American males. I was telling them this a few days later, and these African-American males were far better students than I. They had been better students in high school, both in terms of their grades, their SAT scores, everything. They were doing far better at Tulane. So I'm sitting there and I'm telling them, can you believe this? Can you believe I did this? Oh my God. And they're not saying anything. They're very, very quiet. And they're sort of looking at each other and saying nothing. And I'm just talking, totally oblivious to how they're processing this story. And finally, I'm like, guys, what's up? Like, you're not saying anything. And the one guy's like, man, I don't know if I would have done that. And I said, what, show up at 1 for a test at 10? He's like, oh, no, that's not what I meant. I definitely wouldn't have done that. No way I would have done that. No, I'd have read the damn syllabus on day 1. Trust that I would have not done that. But no, what I mean is, I'm not sure that I would have asked for the do-over. And his friends then all nodded in agreement, and they were all like, yeah, I don't know if I would have either. Keeping in mind, now these are better students than I. And I said, and it confused me. And I said, what do you mean? You would have just taken the incomplete or the F and taken it over? And they're like, well, I don't know for sure because it's never happened, and it's not gonna happen. But I don't know, because you gotta understand, for me to go into that professor's office and admit that I made an error of that magnitude, right? I have to worry about how he views me, not just as the individual I am, but as the black male that I am. At a school where too often black folks and brown folks, male or female or anywhere in between on a gender fluid spectrum, are viewed as not deserving of space. He would have to think about not only how he would be judged as an individual, but as a member of a group, and what the impact of that would be on every other body of color that came through that man's class until the day he retired. And even though that professor probably would have shown him the same grace that he showed me, they could not take that for granted. That was the moment at which I began to understand what privilege was in terms of obliviousness, right? And the edge that gave me, the efficacy that gave me, the strength, the power, the resolve, the sense of self-determination and autonomy that it took to then go and ask for the do-over, knowing that the worst case scenario was he was going to say no and say, well, you know what? Tim Wise wasn't qualified to be a student at Tulane, not white guys. What are we going to do with them, right? So I'll leave it at that. We'll have a wonderful day. We're going to do a lot of learning, a lot of building. Just wanted to frame that for you. Thank you all again so much for being here.
The system in America has been historically designed to work against black people due to a combination of deeply entrenched racism and deliberate policy decisions that have perpetuated inequalities over centuries. Understanding this requires a look at several key areas: historical foundations, economic disenfranchisement, and systemic racism in institutions like housing, education, and the criminal justice system. Firstly, let's look at the historical foundation of racism. The roots of systemic racism in America trace back to the institutions of slavery, which legally dehumanized black people, treating them as property to be bought, sold, and exploited for labor. For over 200 years, slavery built the economic foundation of the nation, particularly in the South, creating a racial hierarchy that placed white people in positions of power and wealth, while black people were systemically oppressed. After the abolition of slavery, black people were subjected to Jim Crow laws, a series of states and local statutes that enforced racial segregations and ensured that black Americans remained second-class citizens. These laws restricted black people's access to education, employment, and voting rights, reinforcing a system of racial inequality that persisted well into the 20th century. Second, let's look at economic disenfranchisement. One of the most significant ways the system has worked against black people is through economic disenfranchisement. After the Civil War, black Americans were promised 40 acres and a mule to help them start a new life. But this promise was quickly rescinded. Instead, black people were subjected to sharecropping, a system that kept them economically dependent and trapped in poverty. In the 20th century, practices like redlining, where banks and insurers mark black neighborhoods as a high risk and refuse to offer loans or insurance there, prevented black families from buying homes in certain areas and building generational wealth. This practice not only limited black home ownership but also led to underfunded schools and services in predominantly black neighborhoods, perpetuating a cycle of poverty and disenfranchisement. Systemic racism in institutions. The criminal justice system is another area where the system has been designed to work against black people. Black Americans are disproportionately targeted by law enforcement, subjected to racial profiling, and receive harsher sentences compared to their white counterparts for the same crimes. This has led to the mass incarcerations of black men, breaking apart families and devastating communities. Education is another institution where systemic racism persists. Schools in predominantly black neighborhoods are often underfunded and overcrowded, leading to disparities in educational outcomes. 4. Perpetuation of inequality. The systemic barriers have been reinforced over generations, creating a cycle of disadvantage for black people. The economic, social, and political system in America have consistently marginalized black communities, limiting their access to resources, opportunities, and power. This cycle of inequality is perpetuated by policies and practices that continue to favor white Americans, making it difficult for black people to achieve the same level of success as the security. Lastly, ongoing impact and the need for change. Addressing these systemic issues requires acknowledging the historical and ongoing impact of racism and actively working to dismantle the policies and practices that perpetuate inequality. These include reforming the criminal justice system. Ensuring equal access to education and economic opportunities, and challenging the societal narratives that continues to dehumanize and marginalize black people. Thank you for watching. Do not forget to like and share your thoughts in the comment box below. Until next time, cheers and have a good one.